My name is Professor Charlie Kolstad. I'm an economist here at Stanford, specializing in energy and environmental economics. On behalf of Stanford's Energy and Environmental Policy Analysis Center, to say that carefully to make sure I get all the words in there, which is CPAC, words right there. I'd like to welcome you to this special evening event, Après Paris, after Paris, what's next for climate policy. Let me just say a few words about the speakers and about this evening's event. CPAC was founded in 2011 by Professor Larry Goulder, and it basically specializes in quantitative methods to solve pressing policy questions in the area of energy and the environment. And what more pressing question could there be than climate change these days? CPAC now has many faculty and students affiliated with it, including myself. Check it out at cpac.stanford.edu. I should say it's a joint venture, and forgive the acronyms, but all the Stanford people are used to that. It's a joint venture of SEPR and PI. SEPR is the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, which is where you are right now, and Precourt Institute for Energy, which is PI. We're grateful to SEPR and PI and friends of CPAC for financial support tonight to make this possible. So I hope you're as excited as I am about today's event. Having toiled in the trenches of climate change for several decades, I think it's really true that I haven't seen this much positive energy and progress in this area for a long time. Over the past few months, but over the past year, there's a lot been happening, and a lot to put a smile on a lot of people's face. Of course, the problem's not solved, but progress is always better than just no progress. This energy was extraordinary, culminating in the Paris meeting, which took place last month, and which you'll hear about today. This evening's group of speakers is uniquely qualified to provide a perspective on Paris and the future of climate policy. We are very appreciative of the speakers giving their time. Let me also announce that Mary Nichols, who was on the program, was unable to make it. She was called away for emergency negotiations with Volkswagen over their diesel problems. So that seemed to trump coming here to talk to us, even though she was very apologetic about that. But we have a great substitute for her, namely her boss, Matt Rodriguez. So you have bios of our four speakers. Many of you do. There's handouts outside, so I won't go into any detail, but it's a very distinguished group. We have Todd Stern, who is President Obama's special envoy for climate change. And let's just summarize it. He's the chief U.S. negotiator for climate change. So he's in charge of climate negotiations for the U.S. government, and the U.S. government has been leading the world in this area recently. Then we have Matt Rodriguez, who's the head of the California EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, overseeing 6 agencies, including the Air Resources Board, which Mary Nichols heads. Then we have Trevor Hauser, who's works in Silicon Valley and has worked in Washington as well, and most recently played a major role in Risky Business, which was an analysis of the economics of what can be done about climate change and the risks associated with it that any prudent someone that's prudent financially should try to avoid. Very important report that came out a year or two ago. And then Jerry Taylor, who's takes a libertarian approach to the environment. At least I hope you don't mind my characterizing you that way. But is a believer that climate needs attention. He's the president of the Niskanen Institute in Washington. And before I introduce the moderator of the coming discussion, let me just say a few words about the organization. We're going to spend about an hour, a little bit less, each speaker providing some initial remarks. Then we'll have about a half hour of discussion among the speakers, moderated by Professor Goulder at the end, and then a half hour of Q&A from the audience. So you can be thinking of concise questions for that final half hour. So let me end by introducing the moderator, Professor Larry Goulder. Larry is a distinguished economist focusing on has focused for many years on the economics of environmental policy. He's the Shuzo Nishihara Professor of Environment and Resource Economics. I'm delighted to have him as a colleague and as a moderator of what I know will be a very stimulating event. So I'll leave it at that.
So our program will begin with remarks by Todd Stern. Todd, take it away.
Thank you very much to Professors Kolstad, Larry, and Charlie, and to everybody who's come out here tonight. Appreciate it, and delighted to be on the stage with all of my co-panelists as well. In my opening remarks, I'm going to say a little bit about why I think the Paris Agreement was important and indeed historic, how we got it done, and then a little bit about the road ahead. And I will try to keep all of that short, so we respect the clock. So in a nutshell, here's why I think that the Paris Agreement is important and I think marks a pivot point in international action on climate change. First, it establishes the first truly universal and durable climate regime that we have had, which is genuinely applicable to all countries. We have had agreements that in some sense apply to everybody, but not in a manner that involves everybody actually, all countries actually taking action. So that's number one. Number two, it sets us on a path of high ambition. To begin with, there were, at the time of Paris, 186 countries who had put in their targets, so-called in the lingo, their INDCs. And that was an absolutely extraordinary fact, an extraordinary number. I think if anybody had asked a year earlier how many on the most optimistic basis, how many countries thought would have put their targets forward by the time of Paris, I don't think anybody would have said more than 140 or 50. So it's quite amazing that you had that kind of buy-in. Just to give some illustration of what that kind of means concretely, the estimate from maybe the best outfit doing these kinds doing this kind of analysis had said about the track we were on in terms of temperature increase in October of 2014 was that looking at all the policies that were in place in the world at that time, we were on track for about a 3.6 degrees Celsius rise in temperature. In October of 2015, after most of these proposed targets had been put forward, that same analytic body estimated that we were on track for a 2.7 degree increase. And 2.7 is still way too high, but it's very far from 3.6, and so a big step forward. There's also, in addition to or beyond the targets themselves, there's a structure of what was agreed to in the Paris Agreement. So there are 5-year cycles for countries to ratchet up their targets to increasing levels of ambition, and those following every 5-year global stocktakes which will see where we are globally in terms of the path that we should be on, the goals that we've taken, and so forth. The agreement includes strong goals to hold temperature increase to well below 2 degrees Celsius over time, and indeed to even pursue a 1.5 degree limit to the extent that that's possible. It also includes, over the course of this century, an ambition our goal to achieve what is essentially climate neutrality. Third, it establishes strong transparency system, which begins with binding transparency requirements with common standards for both developed and developing countries, so applying to everybody. Regular inventories. Inventories are the foundation stone of any kind of transparency system, so regular inventories based on agreed international standards. Regular reporting by countries of both their inventories and their progress toward reaching their targets. Robust review of all reporting, both by expert teams and on a peer basis with other countries. And then flexibility for those developing countries who need it based on their capacity. So not for everybody just because they're in a given category, but to the extent countries need it. And of course, countries have vastly different capabilities, then flexibility with respect to all of these different requirements. So that is, I guess I'm up to number 3. Number 4, the agreement revises in an important way the basic architecture of the climate regime as it has existed for the last 20-some years, with a means of differentiating among countries that looks forward and not back. And in essence, this is differentiation grounded not on whether a country is in one of 2 categories, as the categories were initially drawn up in 1992, essentially developed and developing countries, but as of that time, but instead differentiation based on countries making their own nationally determined choices, again grounded in their actual circumstances and their actual capacities. The firewall between developed and developing countries has essentially been the fault line in climate negotiations for more than 20 years. Kyoto, back in 1997, the first one of these big climate meetings that I attended, embodies the structure with only developed countries asked, in essence, to do anything and developing countries not. And that fact is really what caused Kyoto, in retrospect, to be stillborn. Kyoto didn't end up doing a great deal, and the United States and then many other countries did not participate. From the start of the Obama administration, we were convinced that we had to evolve this architecture, both for substantive reasons, because the reality is right now, developing countries account for about 65% of global, somewhere between 60 and 65% of global emissions. By 2030, it's going to be over 70%. So you can't deal with this very serious and very real problem just on the back of a shrinking amount of emissions in the developed world, and also for political reasons, just not tenable. So significant progress made in that regard. Then finally, the agreement also provided a much enhanced focus on what's called adaptation, countries having to deal with the impacts on climate change that are already happening and that are going to happen no matter what we do. And then continued strong financial assistance to countries who need it. So all of those elements are essentially what we agreed to in Paris in a quite robust way. People have asked me whether we knew at the point that we went to Paris that we pretty much had this in the bag. Was the deal pretty well baked by the time we got to Paris? And the answer is no. We certainly, the issues had been discussed over the course of the previous 4 years, really, and intensively this year. A great deal, but we did not know that we had the thing in the bag at all. There was a meeting October 19th to 23rd of all the countries in the world. These meetings happen at essentially 2 different levels. There's ministerial level meetings like the one in Paris, and during the course of the year, all countries get together at the level one notch below the ministers. So that's, for these purposes, I am not a minister in the U.S. government, but for these purposes, I'm the climate minister. So that happens at a level where my deputy leads our team. And that was a very, very difficult and acrimonious meeting, just a little bit more than a month before the COP. There was essentially a kind of revolt by many countries against a short, concise text that had been put forward by the co-chairs. for a whole bunch of reasons that we don't have time to go into, but it was certainly did not appear at that point that we were on any kind of a glide path to get a deal done. And I came out of that meeting, having been on the phone with my team every day during the meeting, with a conviction that we needed to try to put back together a coalition of progressive countries, both developed and developing, that had not been in strong enough effect during the October meeting, and to do that for the COP. There were also concerns about, there were some countries that were quite interested in having a kind of minimalist agreement that would not say very much, that would give very just sketchy outlines of where we were going, and put off to a later time, to this year and subsequent years, to fill in the details with respect to guidelines, what should actually happen with respect to transparency and other issues, and we didn't want that. We wanted to have as much spelled out as we could, certainly the guiding principles spelled out. And we had concern about the exact issue that I've already talked about, that firewall. There were still many developing countries quite concerned about moving away from that. So there were all of those issues very much in play. I think there were a number of key factors that combined to allow us to get this deal done. Did I just lose my? Still hear me? Okay. I would go through a handful of factors. First, I think there was very strong solidarity among the developed countries, the EU, the United States, and the other non-EU developed countries, which are known in the climate world as the umbrella group. So that united front, I think, as a tactical matter, was very important. I think that number one. Number two, I think that the diplomacy between the United States and China over the last few years, enormously important. There was a dramatic, at least if you're a follower of climate change, it was dramatic, a joint announcement between President Obama and President Xi of China in Beijing in November of 2014, in which we jointly announced our planned targets for Paris. That was an event that provided a huge jolt of momentum to the climate discussions. If you sort of think about this tableau, you have the United States and China as the two kind of 800-pound gorillas in this game, historic adversaries, historic kind of leaders of these two opposing camps. And here you had the two presidents kind of walking arm in arm, saying, this is what we're going to do together, and we're going to get this done. So it was hugely important. I think it jump-started that process of countries doing their own INDCs that I talked about earlier, and that produced the 180 plus. My own, I've got 5 minutes to go. My own diplomacy with my counterpart, Xi Jinping, was, I think, also quite important. We stayed very closely in touch, really for years, but also through Paris. U.S. diplomacy led by President Obama, also very important. The president of Brazil, Rousseff, came to Washington in the summer. The president met twice, 2 different visits with Prime Minister Modi from India. He talked to the President Zuma from South Africa in the weeks leading up to the COP. And we had actually a really important meeting with 5 leaders of island countries when the president was in Paris. My own direct boss, Secretary Kerry, has been active on these issues forever, but also very strongly this year. Last 2 points I would make on what got us there was that progressive coalition that I referenced a little while ago, which we ended up dubbing the High Ambition Coalition. It became very powerful. I mean, these were countries, the islands, the least developed countries, progressives from Latin America, the U.S., the EU, were demanding a strong, ambitious agreement, not willing to take an agreement that was either lacking in ambition or just minimalist. And then I think the French played a really important role. The French had the leadership of this meeting, since it was in Paris. And I think that they were very skilled diplomatically and very committed to a strong agreement. I am going to save issues about the road ahead till our discussion because I think I'm about out of time. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Todd.